The Volga lay beneath a skin of ice so clear it mirrored the sky. Beneath that surface, dark water moved slowly, whispering beneath frozen glass like something dreaming in its sleep. The wind drifted low across the river's spine, carrying the distant groan of shifting ice and the metallic breath of far-off engines that no longer lived. On the western bank, the ruins of Stalingrad crouched under snow, its once thundering heart now a silent carcass. Factories without roofs, chimneys black and skeletal, cranes that reached like broken fingers into a grey horizon. All stood unmoving, embalmed in frost. The few remaining soldiers moved through that stillness like ghosts among ghosts. Their boots cracked thin crusts of ice on rubble. Their rifles gleamed dully in the weak sun, metal colder than bone. From the east, Soviet sentries watched through fogged binoculars. From the west, German scouts peered through cracked scopes. Yet neither side truly looked at the other. What they saw was the same. A city unclaimed by any flag, frozen beyond victory or loss. Some said the air itself had become alive, humming softly, almost electrical, as if carrying unfinished prayers. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere. Wires trembling in the wind, loose sheets of tin breathing with the cold. Even the birds had left, only crows remained, and even they circled high, never landing. In the nights that followed, men swore the river began to speak. It wasn't words, not exactly. More a deep vibration that crawled beneath the ice and up through their boots. When the wind rose, it carried something else, a single note, long and low, the shape of a howl. No one spoke of it aloud, but every man heard it. The city, it seemed, was still awake. Stalingrad was never meant to survive. It was a name drawn on maps, erased and drawn again until only smoke and silence remained. The city had become a wound that refused to close, one stitched together by ash, by hunger, by the stubborn rhythm of hearts that beat only because they could not stop. Both armies fought not for ground, but for something nameless, a sense that if they gave up now, the universe itself might unravel. Flags still fluttered in places where no wind should reach. Their colours were gone, threads stiffened with frost, hanging beside statues scorched black by shellfire. The snow was grey here, not white, never white, carrying flakes of soot that shimmered faintly when the sun broke through. The smell of rust and stone had seeped into everything, as if the air had swallowed memory whole. There were no animals left. Even the rats, those loyal survivors of every human disaster, had vanished. The people who remained, civilians huddled in basements and cellars, prayed to walls that no longer stood. They spoke in whispers, not because they feared the enemy, but because sound itself felt sacred, something the city might punish if disturbed. Years later, veterans would describe this time in strange ways. Some said the air still carried the voices of those who'd fought, murmuring faintly when winter returned. Others swore the snow fell differently there, slower, as if heavy with remembrance. They called it the place where the air remembered, and in that remembering, something unseen began to stir, a feeling in the silence between breaths, in the space where wind paused before moving on. It was not yet a howl, but it was close. Night descended over the ruins like falling metal, slow, deliberate, and heavy with silence. The sky had the dull sheen of gun barrels, and the stars seemed distant, uninterested. Along the riverbanks, sentries huddled beside dying fires, their breath turning white before vanishing into the dark. Every sound felt amplified, the click of a rifle bolt, the whisper of snow against broken glass, the distant groan of shifting ice. Then, amid that stillness, it came, a sound that did not belong. It started low, almost beneath hearing, like the hum of a buried engine. Then it rose, not quite an animal's cry, not quite machinery. Something caught between both, stretched by distance and cold. Men stopped moving. Some crossed themselves. Others turned toward the wind, expecting to see a patrol or a tank. The sound came again, longer this time, its edge metallic, echoing across the frozen river as if carried through hollow steel. Later, a Soviet sentry would describe it as a wolf's cry filtered through armor. Others said it was the wind caught in the wreckage of a tank's turret. But one man, standing on the high ridge near the Red October factory, swore he saw movement. Dark shapes gliding between shell craters, glinting where moonlight touched their backs. No one chased it. No one spoke. The sound faded, and silence returned, heavier than before. The war had paused to listen. They called them Eisenwölfe, Iron Wolves. To the German crews, the name was not a joke, nor a boast. It was a kind of prayer. Each tank was treated less as a machine and more as a living companion, forged in the same crucible as the men who rode it. Before every battle, they would knock twice on the armor, once for luck, once for memory. They spoke softly to the engines as they turned the keys, murmuring names as if waking old animals. Inside the hull, oil fumes mingled with breath and sweat, the heartbeat of pistons filling the air like something alive. But as winter tightened its jaws, those machines began to suffer like the men themselves. Oil thickened into sludge, tracks froze solid, and batteries died in their sleep. Soldiers whispered that the cold was hunting not just flesh, but metal. Yet on some nights, long after entire units had vanished, sentries reported hearing engines rumble through the dark. Distant, rhythmic, as if a column of tanks still moved under the snow. They said the Iron Wolves refused to die. In the moonlight, exhaust smoke rose from nowhere, drifting across open ground where no vehicle stood. Some swore they heard the metallic clank of treads over ice, followed by the echo of a low mechanical growl. Even the skeptics stayed quiet when the wind carried that sound. Whether it was memory, machinery, or something older, no one could say, but every man felt it, that the war had given birth to something it could no longer control. The medic kept a notebook, its pages stiff with frost. He wrote not about medicine, but about sounds, how the wind in Stalingrad had its own voice. When it passed through shattered buildings, it moaned like an organ. When it slipped through ribs and empty helmets, it played higher notes, soft and hollow, like flutes carved from bone. He said it was the city's breath, the echo of everything it had lost. In the trenches, hunger had stripped the men of weight and warmth. They boiled strips of leather from belts and boots, softened it into something chewable. Paper scraps disappeared into mouths like communion wafers. The firewood was gone, the rations gone, the will to speak nearly gone, except when the stories began. That was when the silence broke. The Iron Wolves hunt deserters, they whispered, passing the tale from mouth to mouth like a secret weapon. They wait near the river crossings. They smell fear. The medic listened as men repeated it, half in jest, half in hope. The myth gave shape to what they could not name. The shame of weakness, the terror of dying unseen. It was easier to believe that something powerful still watched over the city, something that punished cowardice and honored endurance. In that belief, hunger became holy. Every breath drawn against the cold was a vow. Every heartbeat under the weight of snow was proof that the human body could still defy winter itself. They no longer fought for orders or flags. They fought because the Iron Wolves might be listening. In December, the cold reached a depth no man could measure. It wasn't merely the absence of warmth. It was the presence of something heavier, a silence so complete it pressed against the skin. A German patrol left their camp before dawn, 6 men moving cautiously through the pale fog toward the river. They were experienced soldiers, veterans of a dozen raids, yet that morning, their formation faltered. The snow beneath them was unbroken, soft and new, but by dusk, when the next patrol searched for their return, the tracks formed a strange pattern, looping endlessly, as if the men had walked in circles, chasing something unseen. 3 days later, they were found. Their bodies stood upright, frozen mid-step, rifles still gripped in their hands, faces turned toward the Volga. Ice had formed across their lashes, sealing open eyes that stared without recognition. Around them lay the snow, torn and ridged, as if something had clawed its way through. But no tracks led in, and none led out. The investigators whispered about hallucinations, exhaustion, madness. Still, they spoke softly, afraid to disturb whatever had stopped those hearts. That night, the wind shifted. It carried a sound low and steady, a distant growl, half buried in the storm. Some said it came from the river. Others swore it rose from the earth itself. Either way, the story spread quickly. Men began to believe the city had chosen sides, that Stalingrad, broken and starving, had learned how to defend itself, not with armies, but with echoes. The first reports came from the radio tents along the frozen ridges. Operators spoke of a strange distortion crawling into their transmissions. Not interference, not feedback, but something almost alive. It began as a low pulse under the static, a slow rhythm that rose and fell like breathing. When they tuned the dials to locate its source, the sound followed, sliding between frequencies as if aware of being heard. At first, they laughed it off. The cold did strange things to the equipment. Wires froze, batteries lost their minds, signals bounced off the ice and came back warped. But one night, a young engineer decided to record it. On the tape, the pulse deepened, shaped by faint harmonics that moved in intervals. A sound neither mechanical nor natural. He described it later as a modulated animal cry. When amplified, it seemed to carry texture, as though the wind itself had grown vocal cords. Senior officers dismissed it as atmospheric noise, but the operators disagreed. They knew the difference between interference and intent. Then, in early January, the pulse began to form syllables. Through the hiss, a word emerged. Faint, repetitive, steady. Back, back, back. The sound was identical across all radios, no matter the frequency. And then, without warning, it stopped. For days afterward, the lines stayed silent. No music from command, no chatter from patrols, just the wind pressing against the tent flaps like a slow, deliberate hand. The air itself seemed to listen. The red October factory loomed over the river like a fossilized beast, its ribs of steel and concrete jutting into the air. Every gust of wind carried the smell of burned metal and old oil, a scent that never froze, no matter how deep the winter bit. Soviet soldiers sheltered within the shattered walls, their breath clouding in the gloom. Fires were forbidden. Light made you a target, yet something else seemed to move among them, something that needed no flame to be seen. One morning, a patrol stumbled upon tracks pressed into the soot. They weren't boot prints nor tire marks, but perfect impressions shaped like paws, each the size of a helmet, spaced evenly, as if whatever left them had marched with purpose. The prints led through collapsed corridors, across iron catwalks, and finally disappeared beneath a collapsed girder. The men followed with rifles raised, expecting an ambush. They found nothing but silence, and the faint smell of hot metal, though the air was cold enough to burn skin. That night, the footsteps returned, padded, deliberate, echoing across the steel floors as if something heavy and patient roamed the darkness. A sniper stationed in the rafters later swore he saw a shape crawling upright through the fog, like a man learning to be wolf. His shot cracked the air, but the echo was swallowed, leaving only the clatter of falling ice. Fear soon hardened into ritual. Soldiers began painting crude white teeth on their helmets, gnawing marks into their rifles, tracing circles of ash around their sleeping places. They said the Iron Wolves respected symbols of strength, that the markings made them pass by in silence. No one laughed at the superstition. In Stalingrad, belief was armor, and even fear had its use. The flare rose slowly, carving a pale arc across the black sky. For a heartbeat, it hung above the ruins like a second moon, its light spilling over the snowfields and broken walls. Every shard of glass, every icicle, flared alive with silver. The men below squinted upward, rifles lifted, their shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. Then someone whispered, not in warning but in disbelief. Shapes were moving through the snow. There were 5, perhaps 6 of them, tall, indistinct, their outlines blurred by the drifting white. They moved with a rhythm too smooth for soldiers, too deliberate for beasts. As the flare light flickered, frost glimmered along their backs like armor, and where skin should have been, something metallic caught the light, not polished, not forged, but grown, as if the winter itself had sculpted them. The figures walked without sound, leaving no clear tracks behind. No one fired. No one spoke. The flare sputtered, dimmed, and fell, vanishing into the black like a swallowed star. Darkness returned with a sudden weight, pressing the breath from every chest. Only the wind moved now, whispering through the ruins as if echoing their fear back to them. When dawn came, half the patrol was gone. The survivors sat in silence, eyes unfocused, rifles untouched. They said the wolves never attacked. They simply walked, slow and patient, until the cold did their work for them. In Stalingrad, even the hunters had learned to wait. The archives hold what little survived of that winter. Pages stained with grease and smoke. Letters frozen mid-thought by the hands that wrote them. Some were never sent, discovered decades later in ration tins or coat linings, their ink blurred by melting frost. Across languages and allegiances, the same details reappeared, as if dictated by the same invisible witness. A German tank commander wrote to his wife, "The snow speaks. It howls in time with the engine. When we halt, the silence presses in, and I swear I can still hear it. Something breathing under the tracks." The letter ends abruptly, the paper torn along a fold. Another note, from a Soviet nurse stationed near the factory district, describes nights when she could not sleep for the sound beneath the floorboards. A steady exhale, rhythmic and wet. She wrote, "The patients whisper that the wolves guard the city. I do not know if they protect or punish." Both letters, separated by front lines and ideology, carry the same tremor, awe disguised as observation. Even engineers, trained to think in mechanical logic, reported patterns in the wind's resonance that matched tank idling frequencies. None of it proved anything, but it repeated too often, from too far apart, to dismiss. Historians call it coincidence. Psychologists call it projection. Yet reading those pages today, the repetition feels deliberate, almost orchestrated, as though something used the human need to explain as its instrument. The wolves may have been myth, but the pattern was real. Two armies, strangers in faith and language, dreamed the same sound. And perhaps that, more than any weapon, was how the city defended itself, through shared imagination that refused to die, even in the coldest silence. The transcript of the debriefing is brief, almost clinical. The officer's voice is steady throughout, unbroken by hesitation or guilt. His name is withheld, though his rank, captain, appears in every margin, as if repetition could anchor him to something ordinary. He speaks not of battles or victories, but of a night he cannot forget. "We stopped fearing the enemy," he says. "We feared what followed us." It had been late winter, 1943. His unit was retreating through the outskirts, engines coughing in the cold, headlights dimmed to narrow cones. The snow fell in slow, soundless sheets, muffling even the creak of treads. Then one of the drivers shouted, "Movement on the ridge." "Figures," he said. The captain ordered a flare. It burst open above them, scattering pale light over the ground. Nothing moved, but the air itself seemed to shudder, as if the light had exposed something it wasn't meant to. They fired anyway, out of habit, out of fear. When the smoke cleared, there was no sign of impact, no blood, no retreat, only silence, thick, almost solid, pressing against their ears until even their own breathing seemed distant. He recounts this without flourish, like a man describing a strange weather pattern. What haunted him, he insists, was not what he saw, but what followed, an emptiness that moved with them for days. Radios failed, engines misfired, footsteps echoed one beat too many. The men began speaking in whispers, afraid that the quiet would answer. "Something out there learned how to listen," he says. Then the transcript ends, his words cut off mid-sentence, followed only by the note, "Subject requested to stop recording." In 1952, nearly a decade after the city fell silent, a Soviet psychologist named Dr. Irina Sokolova began a quiet study of veterans returning from Stalingrad. Her patients arrived with trembling hands and sleepless eyes, claiming to hear sounds that no one else could. The low grind of gears, the hum of engines buried beneath the earth, a mechanical howling that pulsed like the rhythm of a train. Some heard it only in dreams, others in the moments before sleep, when silence should have brought rest. Sokolova documented everything with precision. She measured heart rates, catalogued speech patterns, noted how the descriptions aligned across men who had never met. Her conclusion was cautious. The mind resurrects what the body cannot process. The sound, she wrote, was grief given shape, the echo of endurance replaying itself in memory. To her, the Iron Wolves were not ghosts, but manifestations of trauma, machinery, haunting the human nervous system. But among the recordings stored in her files, one stood apart. It was captured during a session with a former radio operator who claimed the howling still came through his dreams, in Morse. When Sokolova played back the tape, she heard it too. A faint growl beneath the static, steady, cyclical, almost measured. She tested for interference, replayed it in isolation. The sound remained. The file was labeled Anomalous Frequency, Case 12, and quietly archived. No further notes were added. Years later, when the audio was transferred to magnetic reel, the growl still persisted. The same slow rhythm, too deliberate to be wind, too patient to die. The myth that endured was not written in reports or maps, but in the wind itself. Soldiers who returned home told quiet stories to their children, stories of a night when the snow seemed to breathe. They said the Iron Wolves were not spirits in the old sense, but something new, born of the war's machinery and the men who refused to surrender. When the last order was given and there was nowhere left to retreat, they stayed. Flesh froze, metal cracked, and in that moment of stillness, vengeance found a shape. The frost took what remained of them, oil, blood, bone, and sealed it into one enduring will. Locals who wandered the ruins years later spoke of eyes beneath the ice, 2 by 2, glowing faintly when the wind shifted. They would vanish when approached, as though the earth itself guarded its memory. Some said the wolves roamed beneath the frozen river, moving slowly through black water, watching the surface where men once fought. Others believed they rose only when the air grew too quiet, when the land needed to remind itself what it had survived. For the survivors who swore they'd seen them, the wolves were not monsters, but witnesses. They were what remained after purpose burned away, a pact between steel and snow, between creation and decay. Winter took sides, one soldier whispered years later. It chose those who could endure. And so the myth settled into the soil, spreading through every retelling. To believe in the Iron Wolves was to believe that war left something behind, something colder and wiser than man. In the endless silence of Stalingrad, that belief became comfort, proof that even ruin could keep a kind of heartbeat. When the thaw came, it arrived without fanfare, a slow unravelling of ice, a sigh that lasted weeks. The river cracked open in long, echoing groans, and the sound of dripping water replaced the howl that had haunted the city for months. Soldiers who had survived the siege said it was as if the earth itself exhaled. The snow softened, the steel cooled, and Stalingrad, what was left of it, began to breathe again. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was something heavier, something complete. No wind, no engines, no cries, only the quiet pulse of a city remembering what it had lost. Years passed, and the stories faded to rumour. The Iron Wolves became legend, then folklore, then nothing more than the echo of a soldier's tale. But the silence did not stay buried. In the late 1960s, a Soviet icebreaker crew reported hearing metallic voices under the Arctic shelf, faint, drawn-out tones that rose and fell like whale song. Instruments recorded rhythmic pulses within the frozen mass, steady and mechanical. The men joked about the old legends, calling it the wolves migrating north, chasing the cold that once gave them life. Later expeditions logged similar anomalies, deep frequencies resonating beneath the ice, sometimes synchronous with the movement of magnetic storms. No one could trace their origin. Some said they were natural harmonics, others the groan of shifting glaciers. But for those who had heard the stories, the explanation felt smaller than the sound itself. In the evenings, when the Arctic wind swept clean across the ice, researchers swore the tones almost formed words, long stretched syllables fading into distance. The Iron Wolves, they said, had never died. They had simply gone where the winter never ends. Sound never truly dies. It drifts, thins, and scatters. But somewhere in the folds of air, it remains, the faintest vibration waiting to be heard again. History, for all its pages and monuments, keeps its truest memories not in stone but in the atmosphere itself. Every whisper, every heartbeat, every scream from that frozen city still lingers there, dissolved into the breath of the world. The Iron Wolves were never only wolves, nor machines, nor ghosts. They were sound, the voice of endurance, the resonance of will refusing to vanish. When one listens to winter, really listens, the wind carries more than weather. It hums with the same pitch the radios once caught, the same frequency that made men turn their heads and wonder. Perhaps that is how memory survives, not as an image or a fact, but as vibration. What they called a haunting was only remembrance, playing itself back through the corridors of cold. The Iron Wolves were that echo, neither dead nor alive, but sustained by the need to be remembered. The city they guarded is long rebuilt, its scars hidden beneath glass and steel. Children walk where tanks once froze, markets stand where trenches caved in. Yet on the coldest nights, when snow begins to fall without wind, there are moments when the air grows strangely heavy and silence itself feels alive. People stop mid-step, not knowing why, and listen. Some swear they hear it, the low hum beneath everything, distant and steady, the sound of breath through iron. In that quiet, the war becomes something else. Not violence, not victory, but persistence. The Iron Wolves were never there to frighten or avenge. They were what remained when everything else had broken. A reminder that the will to endure, once born, cannot be buried. It lingers, humming beneath the centuries, patient as frost. And so, each winter, when the wind moves across the Volga, it carries that old refrain, faint, measured, and eternal, the song of men who stood until the snow itself howled back.